Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here for this meeting. I'm very pleased to have the privilege of opening up this meeting, although it was not the original plan, but things happened that way, and I'm very pleased that it's that way. And I'm very pleased because I see this discussion about jobs and shared prosperity as the natural follow-up to work that was started last year in parallel, on the one hand with the Jobs World Development Report and on the other hand with the Jobs Knowledge Platform. Other previous World Development Reports had as an aftermath, as a sequel, an attempt to operationalize them, which did not happen in the case of the Jobs World Development Report. But on the other hand, I think that shared prosperity is exactly that. Is the focus on shared prosperity is the operationalization of the centrality of jobs and these messages from jobs. So let me try to give a few hints from our experience, our work with the World Development Report, and how I see that connected with shared prosperity. And on how it connects to shared prosperity, I want to use a South Asian perspective, which is where I am now in the South Asia region. On why jobs connect to shared prosperity. As you know, we have been seeking over the last few months a way to really operationalize these objectives of eradicating poverty and shared prosperity. And at one level, those two goals translate into some kind of metric, something we measure, how many people below $1.25, what is the percentage growth of the income or consumption of the poorest 40% of the population. But there is more than just the measure. In a way, I would say that the shared prosperity and poverty are also what happens behind these numbers and how we get there. And I will argue that in both cases, jobs are extremely central. In the case of poverty, one of the things we did for the World Development Report was a couple of things. One was to decompose poverty reduction over time and to see whether it was labor events, transfers, other events that were behind the reduction in poverty. And what we found is that jobs and labor-related income were the main driver of poverty reduction. The other thing we did is to look at panels in which we could follow households over time and see for households who had moved up above the poverty line, whether labor or non-labor events had been determinant. And we found again that earning more in your job, moving to a better job, having more people in the household at work were again the main determinant of these transitions, and even more so in poor countries. In the case of shared prosperity, I will argue that there is more than, in addition, the income. I think, in a way, what we wanted to capture with the notion of shared prosperity is the idea of belonging into the mainstream, which happens through earnings, but happens also through other things that job brings. And jobs bring networks, they bring a sense of opportunity, they sometimes bring access to protection in different forms. They are often a mechanism for voice. And so when you look at the work we did in the World Development Report of last year, it was very much about how jobs bring these dimensions, income dimensions, but also other dimensions of belonging and also of making society function better. So we structure our work along the ideas of jobs and living standards, jobs and productivity, and jobs and social cohesion. So in a way, both in the case of poverty and shared prosperity, you have this importance of jobs that goes beyond earnings. Let me make two other points before I turn to the panel. And I must say I'm delighted that in the panel we had two very good friends of the World Development Report, in Ravi, who was in our panel of advisors, and Jaime, who was discussant, and a tough discussant at times, of the report in a very positive way. The second point I want to make is that when we say jobs, what do we mean by jobs? And they're one of our findings and one of our key messages in the World Development Report, which I hope will be, in a way, followed through in the discussion today, is that mentally we tend to drift to a definition of jobs that is quite narrow. We have been intellectually prisoners of a model in which a job is a relationship between an employer and an employee. It turns out that that is true for about half of the people at work in the world, is true for much less than half in the developing world, and for a fraction in the poorest countries, because most people are farmers and self-employed. And many of the tools we have to think about jobs are tools that come from this supply, demand, mismatch, gaps, and employment vacancies. For a lot of people, the relevant jobs are not those jobs that have an employer, those jobs where the opportunity has to do with working a farm or with making smallholder farming more productive or with moving to towns. And I will argue that very few of the transitions out of poverty that we are interested in when looking at the eradicating poverty objective have to do with moving to formal wage employment. Most of these transitions are transitions that involve being a more productive farmer or taking off-farm employment or moving to informal wage employment in cities. It may be different in the case of shared prosperity, where we may have more of the movement to formality. But even in countries that are already high middle income, low middle income, we still see a lot of the dynamics of making inroads in development related to informal employment. I think the tools of labor economics, which are very powerful and very useful in many environments, do not cover everything. And so when we think about jobs and shared prosperity, issues such as how do you get voice for people in the informal sector? What is the voice that is relevant? We may not necessarily be well-equipped intellectually. We tend to build narratives that go around the wage employment relationship. Even if you think of cases like the Arab world, the narrative we will have about how the events in the Arab world started is a narrative in which a young man who is unemployed sacrificed his life in Tunisia to protest the fact that he's unemployed. And the reality is that that young man was not unemployed, he was a street vendor, and he was protesting abuse by city authorities. And so the kind of relationship, the voice and space for this person to have a more productive job and to have a space in society had to do with very different players. So the second point I wanted to leave, the first one is jobs are central to poverty reduction and shared prosperity. The second one is jobs are way more than just wage employment. Let's not be prisoners of that. For a lot of the countries we deal with, understanding what will make informal sector jobs more productive, what will help people who migrate from rural areas to cities to integrate and get networks, what will give a sense of opportunity through these jobs that may not be the kind of ideal job. That is very important. One exercise that to me was very revealing is we went like 4 times through the report in the final editing. The number of times when we use the expression labor market to refer to something that means employment and not labor market. I would say how many people enter the labor market every year. Well, we mean how many people enter the labor force every year, not necessarily the labor market. Many of them is just they go start working in the farm or things like that. So that's the second point I wanted to make. So now let me say something from the South Asia perspective, which is where I have my hat now, is that we have been thinking, in fact, my next meeting, unfortunately I have to leave after this, is we're preparing a flagship on inequality for the region, although now they cannot be called flagship, but we're preparing a report for the region on inequality, which is very much about shared prosperity. It started being called inequality, but when we look at it, it's about the mechanisms through which we get this traction that is not just crossing the poverty line, but getting firmly on the other side, not falling back, having a sense of that you can keep moving. And increasingly we are articulating that shared prosperity, and I think this is a discussion in which Jaime and others will have a lot to say over the coming months in the bank. We are trying to organize that around 3 mechanisms. One on which we had worked quite a lot before, which is the equality of opportunity. It is the fact that you get access to services, you get access to education and health, regardless of the background to which you were born. Another one is the vulnerability, not falling back, social protection and mechanisms to cope with shocks. And the one in the middle is jobs and the mobility. So we see it as opportunity, mobility, and protection, what we see behind the shared prosperity. And that central part of mobility is where we see the jobs as being extremely central. So I'm really sorry that I didn't learn about that I had to be here earlier, because I would have tried to organize things differently, but I wish I could be here all day, but I will continue with the organizers and to try to learn what was the outcome of the discussion. So let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm Dave Wessel from the Wall Street Journal. I have the honor of moderating a panel. We're in the process of demonstrating that you can live in an advanced economy and have infrastructure problems. So one of our panelists is stuck on the red line somewhere, but he'll be here eventually. But fortunately, we have 2 out of 3, and that's more than enough. To my left is Jaime Saavedra, who's the acting vice president of the Poverty Reduction and Economic Management Network at the bank, and was previously with think tanks and various entities in Peru. And to his left is Ravi Kanbur, who has the virtue of having once worked at the World Bank, but no longer working at the World Bank, which gives you that wonderful perspective. He's, of course, now a professor of world affairs and many other things at Cornell University. We're going to do this very informally. I'm going to start by asking them some questions and getting some conversation going, and I hope you'll join. And there's some magic technology where people who are watching online or on Twitter can add questions, and we'll get to them before we end. But Ravi, I wonder if I could start with you for a little historical perspective. So is something different now? Did we used to think that economic growth and transfer payments were the way to reduce poverty, and now we've discovered that jobs are important?
Well, what do I...
Push the button on the left. If you vote yes, there's more people out of poverty, and if you vote no, there's fewer people out of poverty.
Good. Well, as I think the infrastructure problems have been solved. So. Yeah.
Welcome.
Yeah.
Thank you. Apologize for being late.
Good. So I think as Martin said, I was an advisor on the World Bank report. So now there are some things in it that I disagree with, but much of it I do agree with. So I think the broad framework of growth and distribution, which has served us well as a broad framing thing, I think that's perfectly valid. It's how one goes from that. The next step, I think that's where the issue arises. And in that context, I think the way the WDR says it, and the way that I would say it, is that to say, well, somehow we're going to get growth going, and then we're going to redistribute, is not the right way to think about it. If, on the other hand, we think about different things, including employment, but also social protection and so on, right from the start, then I think we have a better chance of discussing the operationalization of that broad framework. So that's how I would put it. So it's not that we're junking what was there before, but I think operationalization of it does require that we take these next few steps.
And Jaime, what does this mean in practice? How does this change what the bank advises governments to do and what the bank itself does?
I think we're in the process, right, of finding out how will that shape our advice. But let me make 2 points. The first one related to what Ravi said. We are now precisely in this stage of operationalizing what the new goals of the bank might mean. One of the goals is reducing extreme poverty or ending extreme poverty. The other goal is increasing shared prosperity. And at the end of the day, shared prosperity, the way we are thinking of it, there are many ways you can define shared prosperity. Where we're defining shared prosperity basically as increasing welfare of the less well-off, right? We are then using a measure that is incomes of the bottom 40%, right? But that's something that you need to, just one way of measuring, but at the end of the day, in terms of the substance, is increasing welfare of the less well-off in each country. And just to pick up on the latter point that Ravi was making, I don't think in order to move in that direction, we should think of a sequence that it's growth then redistribution, right? But they should be thought as a parallel process or a joint objective, right? That not any growth does the trick, right? It has to be a growth, right? That affects and incorporates the lives and the way the poor engage in this process. So we cannot see that as first grow, then redistribute. It has to be growth with a specific social contract that makes everyone part of that, right? I can elaborate a bit more, but let me leave it at that point now.
Thank you. Let me introduce Michael Chui, who's with the McKinsey Global Institute and has, as far as I know, never worked at the World Bank. There's still time. The emphasis of the conversation has been a kind of, if I may put it, a rediscovery of the importance of employment. And Martin pointed out that employment doesn't necessarily mean working for a paycheck. And of course, somewhere in there, there's the notion underlying it that the private sector is a necessary ingredient in this. But I think that in the past couple of weeks, the devastation of that factory in Bangladesh must teach us something, that just giving people jobs itself is not sufficient if they're jobs that end up in their death. So what sense do you make of what happened in Bangladesh if our goal here is to get people working and out of poverty?
First of all, I'm given the tragedy there, I'm not sure I can add a lot of sense to that particular tragedy. I do agree with the point that the private sector is extraordinarily important. Most of my research isn't actually in developmental economics, but to a certain extent focused on innovation and technology. I think some of the things which are important about that story is, I think previously that story might not have been covered or known as much as it has, partly because the connectivity that technology and other innovations allow us to have. And so, again, look, ideally these tragedies never happen. And the breakdowns in the private sector never happen. But I think some of the transparency that's afforded by global connectivity gives the potential for some, name and shame to occur, but hopefully, preferably in the future, for more preventative measures to happen as well.
Ravi?
So maybe I can focus the question in the following way, leading on from the Bangladesh situation, is what exactly is the role of labor regulations in all this, which is a hot button issue in South Asia, in India certainly, in other places. I mean, I think we skirt this issue quite often within the bank and so on as well. So going back to the way Martin characterized it, first of all, as he said, all jobs are not straightforwardly employer-employee relationships. There's the self-employment, informal employment, etc. That, I think, is a very important point to make. Secondly, even within those jobs which are standard sort of jobs, a very important point that the World Development Report makes is that things other than regulations are very important. The land market in urban areas is very important for growth of those sorts of jobs. Infrastructure provision, getting the power flowing properly, etc., is perhaps even more important for creation of those sorts of jobs than the standard labor regulations or factory regulations type story. But thirdly, within that narrow realm of factory regulation, etc., the WDR, I think, very importantly says we have to avoid the cliffs on either side. Okay? So this notion of heavy, which actually one gets on labor regulation, heavy focus on labor regulation, both from the political left and from the political right in many ways, saying if only these regulations are removed, then there will be fantastic growth, etc. I think is misplaced. In the middle. Not much happens in terms of these regulations. One of the conclusions, you can strengthen a little bit, weaken a little bit, but it's the cliffs that you have to avoid. And I think it's fairly clear to me that in the Bangladesh context, we're clearly on one side of the cliff. So it's a very country-specific thing. It's a very context-specific thing. But I think we have to identify those cliffs analytically, empirically, and in the policy context. So I think that's the sort of thing that the WDR is. That's what I took away from the WDR.
Jaime, one of the points that Martin made is that there's still a lot of people who work in agriculture and perhaps the way to improve the quality of their lives is not to get them out of agriculture and to work in a textile factory in Bangladesh, but to improve the quality of their life and their productivity on the farm. Does that mean that part of the solution here is to convince governments to invest more in this agriculture sector, or is that just trying to hold back the tide because we know that people have to leave the farm?
Agriculture will be critical for poverty reduction now, and most of the reductions in poverty that will come from that sector will come in the medium term from increases in labor productivity, right? But that necessarily will mean that then employment will necessarily grow in that sector. So you need a combined strategy in which, on one hand, you increase labor productivity in the agricultural sector, but also facilitates the movement out of agriculture to small towns or medium-sized cities. I mean, one cannot expect that there will be increasing growth in productivity in agriculture and also an increase in jobs in agriculture. So it has to be a mixed strategy in which you, on one hand, increase, fast agricultural productivity and hence labor incomes, but at the same time, that will generate the possibility of those same people to engage, to acquire more education, to engage in off-farm activities, and eventually some of them move out of agriculture. So that will be the healthy process.
Martin, you mentioned that one of the advantages of technology is that it provides a transparency so that we can put pressure on situations like Bangladesh. But of course, I think there's a widespread sense, I'm not advocating it, but a sense that somehow what technology is doing is creating an extremely competitive global labor market because work can increasingly be done all sorts of different places, and that somehow the inevitable result is the opposite of shared prosperity. That what technology is a way for people who have control of it to get more of the rents and people who don't have it to be forced to compete with people who they never see. Do you look at it differently, or is there something to that?
I think the story about technology is very complicated. I think there is a thread, evidenced by Brynjolfsson and McAfee's work, Race Against the Machine, which says, increasingly we used to say there are some things that people do well and some things that machines do well. And that frontier of what machines can do continues to cut into what people are able to do, even knowledge work, right? We used to say, farming and transformational work are things that can be automated away, but people who are doing, work that's knowledge work are safe, and yet that continues to move on. So there is a narrative that says technology gains the capital at the expense of labor. At the same time, there are other mitigating effects in which technology can actually increase the ability of individuals, for entrepreneurs, et cetera, to create productive economic outcomes. And so, it is possible for it, and also the transparency afforded by it also allows people to have that social debate about, equality and shared prosperity. So I don't think it's obvious that it goes one way or another. I think technology, to a certain degree, we've described as an amplifier, and it can both amplify the dialogue around shared prosperity, but it can also amplify the power of people who want to capture rents.
So he's not an economist, but don't you think he's actually perfected the two-handed answer? Ravi, you want to?
Yeah, so let me see if as an economist I can emphasize perhaps the left hand more than the right hand. So I want to respond both to the inequality question and to going back also to the ag-non-ag issue that you raised as well. So, again, I don't need to tell anyone in the room that inequality is on the increase in most parts of the world, and in those parts of the world, like Latin America, where it is declining, you can put that decline down to proactive policy efforts. Last year, I co-authored the Asian Development Bank's Asian Development Outlook theme chapter called "Confronting Rising Inequality in Asia." And 83% of Asia's population lives in countries where inequality has increased over the last 20 years. And if growth had taken place at the same rate without the inequality increase, something like 250 million more people would have been lifted out of poverty in Asia. So it matters. Secondly, what are the underlying reasons for this? I think, by and large, there's agreement that technology has indeed played a role, both in terms of shifting the share of income going to capital versus going to labor, and then within labor, skilled versus unskilled. There are the other issues which I of course I agree with in terms of greater transparency and so on. But in terms of the sheer economic analysis, economic outcomes of it, this force is clearly very strongly pushing towards an increase in inequality. It's also very strongly pushing towards increase in overall growth, increase in income. So it's not that we're like Canute-like, we say, no, we don't want to do this. But we have to manage this. We have to manage this process, and how one manages that is the issue, and some of the issues that are raised in terms of investment in employment, investment in social protection, and so on is important.
Can I ask Jaime if he wants to respond to technology before you get back to agriculture?
No, on that issue, that relates very much to the story behind shared prosperity, right? Because the point on inequality is really it's very much linked to the discussion of shared prosperity, but it's not exactly the same as shared prosperity. If you think how we're defining shared prosperity, we're saying it's increasing incomes of the less well-off, right? When we had the discussion of how to define shared prosperity, some people would say, well, why don't we have that variable, but with respect to average growth, right? So there is shared prosperity where the incomes of the bottom, right, grow faster than the average. The reason why we didn't say, well, let's not use that inequality definition would be because there might be certain circumstances in which incomes of the poor are growing faster than the average, but are growing at a very slow rate. So you could have an increase in the incomes of the poor of 1%, the average is growing at 0.5%, you say, okay, good, we had shared prosperity. So we said, no, let's make sure that we're focusing first of all, the incomes of the poor. Now, at the same time, even if you say shared prosperity is increasing incomes of the poor, one has to recognize that in the medium term, and sometimes not that medium term, it's unsustainable, right? To have increases in incomes of the poor that are consistently below average, right? And if one see what happens to inequality along development in general, there are no countries who have passed the middle income stage and moved to high income with high levels of inequality, right? And if you see poor countries, it's all over the place. There's high inequality, low inequality. If you see rich countries, in general, they will tend to have, maybe except the U.S., they will tend to have lower inequality. So that issue of thinking of what are the mechanisms to reduce inequality in the medium term come together with development, right? And they are related to, on one hand, I would say, how to manage technology, right? It's not that we will be in favor or not. I mean, it's an issue of how to manage. How do we make sure that, on one hand, on the opportunity side, right, everyone has the opportunities in order to be part of that process, but on the other hand, in the regulation side, how do we make sure that everybody has the same voice in that process? And that latter part is what might be related also to the issue of labor regulation, right? The two cliffs of labor regulation is let's make sure that we don't make them so stringent so that there is a reduction in efficiency, but let's not make them so lax that then you are not protecting workers, right, and not giving the right voice to workers. So again, it's an issue of managing that process and being in that plateau in the middle in which labor regulations are not not harmful for growth, for employment creation, but on the other hand, they're not harmful in terms of not protecting workers, right?
So Ravi, Michael, and then
yeah, if I could just add one other point, which by no means do I want to minimize the importance of income inequality as a measure of shared prosperity. I think just when we're thinking about the impact of technology, I also want to just throw into the mix the fact that, in terms of metrics, we usually don't include consumer surplus. And again, it's not that income isn't extraordinarily important. But I think oftentimes the role of technology is to accelerate value capture by consumers, and that is often underappreciated in terms of the welfare and benefits that people receive. So all the benefits that we get from things that we don't pay for, online services, et cetera, usually aren't measured. And again, it's that's not going to feed your family at the end of the day. So we've got to fix that problem. But there are tremendous benefits that come from technology that aren't measured in GDP and income.
Ravi, you wanted to make a point on agriculture, I believe.
Yeah, but let me just say that Yeah, no, agreed. I think quality changes are not very well captured by our measures and our price indices and so on and so forth. That's certainly true. But to the extent possible, I think most of the inequality measures that are calculated by the World Bank, for example, are actually based on consumption data in developing countries. No, they're not really income inequality, it's consumption data. Your point is nevertheless valid that consumption data may not capture the latest improvements, but it's not really income that one's measuring. So when we say income inequality, technically what we really mean is consumption inequality as being measured. So let me go to this ag, non-ag, and also formal, not informal sort of divide. I think there's a tendency, again, I mean, in my own writings, as in other people's writings, to say you've got to do both. You've got to do both more ag and more non-ag, okay? I think that, on the one hand, that's probably a cop-out, okay, in the sense that, if you have $100 million to spend, I can pose the question to you, which would you prioritize? Would you prioritize investment in rural roads? Or would you prioritize investment in urban infrastructure in order to whatever? And I think we have to have we have to at least have a method of thinking through an answer to that question, or at least give the finance minister a way of thinking about that question. To say, well, we should do both, that may be right, but then you have to tell me how you want to do it. Is it 50-50, 50 million, whatever? To say we've got to do both, I think it takes us off the hook in some sense. Okay? And how do we decide? I'm going to come to the formal, informal thing in a minute as well, but how do we decide between one versus the other? And I think short run versus long run issues are going to be important here, because it may well be true. I mean, it still has to be empirically solidly established. It may well be true that if I invest in urban areas, the agglomeration economies take hold,